morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Yay! Thank you for being here. Welcome to our Piano Teachers Congress of New York workshops. We are a nonprofit that is dedicated to serving piano teachers in the tri-state area. We have student programs, and this is the third of 6 professional development workshops that we host throughout the year. So we're thrilled to be here. I want to thank especially Hunter for hosting us and Jeffrey Brillon, our head of the piano department. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for being here. Would you like to come up and say a few words?
No.
Okay. Thank you so much for hosting us. We're very, very grateful to be in this space and to have this partnership. I would like our Piano Teachers Congress board members to just wave a hand. If anyone has any questions about the PTC or joining or working with any of our programs, you're welcome to ask them any questions. Oh, I am the president. My name is Margarita Rovinskaya. I forgot to introduce myself. We are so honored and so pleased to have Rebecca Cypess with us here today. She is such a phenomenal scholar, musicologist, general musician, and we're so thrilled to have this performance today of Madame Brillon and the 18th century English square piano. So I would like to introduce her before she comes up here. Musicologist and historical keyboardist Rebecca Cypess is the Mordecai D. Katz and Dr. Monique C. Katz, Dean of the Undergraduate Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yeshiva University. She is the author and editor of 7 books, including Women and Musical Salons in the Enlightenment, and author of over 45 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. Dr. Cypess is the founder and director of the Raritan Players, a period instrument ensemble that seeks to recover untold stories and repertoires from the musical past. The group's recordings have been praised as simply mesmerizing, enchanting, and an unexpected treasure. Cypess has been the recipient of the Ruth A. Soley Award for an outstanding collection of musicological essays and the Noah Greenberg Award for contributions to historical performance, both from the American Musicological Society. She's also a phenomenal musician, scholar, was on faculty at Rutgers and New England Conservatory, and my own professor of musicology at Rutgers, so it's such a thrill and honor for her to be here today. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. And Rita, thank you again for this very kind invitation to speak with the Piano Teachers Congress. It's really an honor. I'm also pleased I only have to talk to one half of the room. This is good. So everybody stay where you are. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about what might seem like a historical curiosity, but one that I think sheds a lot of light on women's musicianship in particular and keyboard culture in the second half of the 18th century. So I'll start with a story. In the summer of 2022 and again in the summer of 2023, I was invited to record some music for an Apple TV series titled Franklin, which stars Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin during his years in Paris as ambassador to the French court. The series depicts Franklin's diplomatic efforts as well as his personal relationships, including with the many women whom he got to know in Paris. Among these women was Anne-Louise Boivin d'Ardencourt Brillon de Jouy, or Madame Brillon, an aristocratic musical amateur who composed, played multiple instruments, and sang. The music that I was asked to record for the series included compositions by Madame Brillon, as well as Scottish airs of the sort that Benjamin Franklin knew and loved, and that were performed in Brillon's home. I jumped at the opportunity. And I shared gleefully with the series music director that I had access to the perfect instrument for the job. Since 2019, I have been very fortunate to have on long-term loan an English square piano, which you see here, built by the pioneer of that instrument, the German-born instrument builder Johannes Zumpe, or Zumpi. And the instrument was built in London in 1780. It is almost identical to one that Brillon owned. And I've used it to record music by Madame Brillon and pieces that she is known to have played or were dedicated to her. We know about Brillon's instrument collection from her own compositions, some of which bear explicit designations for harpsichord, as you see here, clavecin, piano allemand, and piano anglais. So she owned at least these 3 types of keyboard instruments. And she certainly had her English square piano, that instrument I showed you a moment ago, by the late 1760s, which is quite early in the instrument's history. You can see that it appears in the background of her portrait by Jean-Honoré Fragonard, right? And you can sort of see the lid is propped open against the wall in the background of the portrait. It's a little bit sketchy, but that's Fragonard's style, so. While the music producer of the series, Franklin, was happy for me to use the square piano for the audio recordings, the director apparently found its appearance insufficient for his purposes. Instead of the modest-looking Zumpe, as you see here, or even a more lavishly decorated square piano from the same period, like this one, the director decided instead on an elaborately painted Erard grand piano from around 1843, similar to the one shown here, at least 60 years later than the instrument that Madame Brillon owned. I advised, I protested, I pleaded, but to no avail. Thus, when the series appeared, it featured an instrument that sounds just like the one that Madame Brillon owned, but looks nothing like it. I confess that I'm probably one of 3 people in the world who noticed or cared. Okay. This episode highlights a gap between piano culture of the 18th century and our own modern perspectives. English square pianos are often viewed as inferior substitutes for grands. This has been true even as the historical performance movement has come to embrace instruments from increasingly wider geographic and temporal ranges in the past 25, 30, 40 years. Yet the widespread adoption of the square piano in the 18th century by people from virtually every social rank, from farmers' daughters right up through the royal families of Europe, paints a different picture. The square piano permeated England and France, it spread to Spain and Italy, and could soon be found in locations across the British Empire, from India to Australia to Jamaica. Although the London-based builder Americus Backers began developing grand pianos in England by the early 1770s, and these were soon used in public performances, organologist and musicologist Michael Cole has argued convincingly that square pianos retained their primacy for some time. So they weren't just considered inferior to the grand or a poor substitute for the grand, but an instrument in their own right. Unmarked references to pianofortes in England and France from the mid-1760s through the 80s likely refer to the square piano and not the grand. Although square pianos were probably used in public concerts as early as 1767 and 68 by the likes of Charles Dibdin and Johann Christian Bach, these instruments were most highly valued in domestic settings and salons. Bach's publication of his Opus 5 sonatas pour le clavecin ou le pianoforte in 1766 suggests that the instrument was already being widely used in domestic settings, right? So these sonatas would have been intended for performance in the home, most likely by women. This domestic association resonates with patterns of purchase and usage. Examining anecdotal evidence and statistical information from the records of keyboard instrument sellers and even keyboard tuners, Cole has determined that roughly 80% of piano players in London in the 1770s and 80s were women, and that these women played a pivotal role in the rising popularity of the new instrument. Cole offers several reasons why the square piano was embraced so enthusiastically by women. These include its tone, which was often described as extremely sweet, the novelty of its pedals and some of its stops. Some instruments included stops that you could engage that would alter the timbre and resonance of the instrument, the infrequency with which it required maintenance, its reasonable price, about the third of the cost of a harpsichord, and women's desire to emulate Queen Charlotte, Marie Antoinette, and other royals across Europe who adopted the square piano enthusiastically. So there's kind of a cyclical enthusiasm for the piano. Its popularity led the royals to adopt it, which in turn made it more desirable and accessible to more women. This morning, I'd like to share with you an episode from the history of the square piano through the story of Madame Brillon, who was one of its early adopters. Widely known as an accomplished keyboardist and composer, she also assembled a large collection of music, some of which survives in private hands today. She held regular gatherings of friends and professional musicians, what we now call salons, which featured music prominently. as well as good food and drink, literary theatrical games, games of chess, which she played with Franklin, and often witty conversation about the latest social, cultural, and intellectual trends and fashions. At these gatherings, she hosted a variety of guests, men and women, statesmen and philosophers, amateur and professional musicians. Written accounts of her salon, as well as the surviving scores from her collection and the published music dedicated to her, present a picture of a highly skilled musician and a woman at the center of musical culture in late 18th century Paris. Accounts of Madame Brillon's salon, including her musicianship, survive from many of her guests and friends, including Franklin, and thus her inclusion in the Apple TV series about his life. Franklin and Brillon exchanged countless letters, over 100 of which survive today, many of which discuss her musicianship or their shared musical interests. One letter from Brillon to Franklin highlights the private, exclusive nature of her salon, which was inextricably linked to her status as an aristocratic woman. In that capacity, she had wealth and privilege, but her conduct, as for all upper-class women, was subject to the constraints of the social norms of the day, and these restricted her from full participation in the public sphere, which would have been considered unseemly. As she explained to Franklin, "I am a woman, and my lot and my taste are modesty. I have a lively mind, and nothing prevents me from using it, but only for myself and my most intimate friends." And whether this is tongue-in-cheek or not, I think it probably is, it did actually circumscribe the activities in which she participated in the public sphere. The square piano, a vehicle of private artistry and sociability, was nevertheless a novelty at the time when Brillon first acquired one. The square piano's association with domestic intimacy and its novelty made it the ideal vehicle for her and other women like her. Listening to the sounds of the square piano, including music that she composed expressly for it, affords us a deeper understanding of women's musicianship that remained in many ways veiled behind a curtain of privacy. Nevertheless, through the platform of her salon, where she welcomed guests, including the greatest composers of Europe, I argue that Brillon and her square piano had a marked influence on public musical life in late 18th century Europe. The most famous account of Madame Brillon comes from the diary of that intrepid traveler and music historian, Charles Burney, who visited her within 2 weeks of leaving England for his tour of France and Italy. Burney's private diary, as well as his resulting published work, The Present State of Music in France and Italy, contained detailed descriptions, only portions of which I will discuss here. The whole episode, the whole passage is really interesting. Burney calls Brillon one of the greatest lady players of the harpsichord in Europe. And he says, "Madame Brillon in person is rather pretty, but in her manner charming, polite, easy, and always naturally cheerful." And note that word natural, right? That's a recurring theme. "There was a good deal of company at dinner, which was excellent and bien servi. After coffee, we went into the music room where I found an English pianoforte which Mr. Bach had sent her, and that is indeed Johann Christian Bach, who seems to have worked as an agent for the Zumpi firm, so helping to spread pianos throughout London and across Britain and indeed in France. She played a great deal, and I found that she had not acquired her reputation in music without meriting it." In support of his assessment, Burney notes in the published version of his account that many of the famous composers of Italy and Germany who have resided in France at any time have dedicated their works. Among these are Schobert and Boccherini. And indeed, it is no coincidence that this published portrait by Burney refers to Brillon's status in relation to other publications. So the idea of a published work, whether a composed piece of music or a music history or music journal or diary, if they're published, by definition, they enter the public sphere to some extent and they circulate publicly. Whereas Madame Brillon's compositions and her sort of musicianship had to remain circumscribed by at least the semblance of privacy. So indeed, Boccherini and Schobert, together with Henri Joseph Riegel and Ernst Eichner, dedicated works to Brillon, and I'll return to a couple of these publications a bit later. These dedications, plus Johann Christian Bach's involvement in helping her acquire the square piano, point to her strong network of connections in the professional musical world, and those were the very connections that brought Bernie to her door. So Bernie worked in London and likely had a recommendation from J.C. Bach to go and visit Madame Brillon during his tour of Europe. Bernie goes on to praise Brillon's skill as a composer. She likewise composes and was so obliging as to play several of her own pieces, both on the harpsichord and pianoforte, accompanied with the violin by Monsieur Pagin, who is reckoned in France the best scholar of Tartini ever made. Her skills as a player enabled her compositions. She plays on several instruments, Bernie writes, knows the genius of all that are in common use, which she said it was necessary for her to do in order to avoid composing for them such things as were either impractical or, keyword again, unnatural, right? So she's using the technology of the instruments in a way that is, quote, natural. Bernie criticizes only one aspect of Brillon's performance, and I think that this is another sort of key moment, but he still is reserved in his criticism. He says, I could not persuade Madame B to play the pianoforte with the stops on. C'est sec, she said. But with them off, unless in arpeggios, nothing is distinct. 'Tis like the sound of bells, continual, and sorry, that word should be confluent, not confident, but confluent. So what does it mean to stop using, what does it mean to play the pianoforte with the stops on? That means releasing the pedal. She overuses the pedal on the square piano, and this is, I think, another kind of like a really important aspect, so I'll talk a little bit more about that. Overall, Bernie's praise crosses the line into hyperbole. Yet what interests me is not so much the hyperbolic nature or general terms of his account, but the specific facets of her musicianship that he mentions. And I think there are three interconnected points that stand out. First, her interest in multiple types of keyboard instruments, and we know about that because she owned at least 3 different keyboard instruments. Second, her use, or in his view, overuse of the damper raising pedals on her English piano. And third, her intimate knowledge of the various instrument technologies at her disposal, which allows her to produce music that transcends technology to achieve this perceived state of the natural. As I'll show, all 3 of these points are borne out in her compositions, and as I argue, all 3 are critical factors in what I consider her musical poetics, her approach to composition, and her musical ideals. Brillon's manuscript compositions survive today in the collection of the Library of the American Philosophical Society, just down the road in Philadelphia, an institution that Benjamin Franklin founded. The APS acquired these manuscripts in the 1950s. Almost none of her works have been published in modern edition, but they are available, the manuscripts are available on the APS website. I believe you can access most of them online. Today, the compositions for which she is best known are her duos for harpsichord and pianoforte, and the trios for harpsichord, English piano, and German piano. She also wrote at least one sonata for piano and harp together. These works are remarkable for their codification of the practice of juxtaposing different keyboard timbres and technologies. And elsewhere, like in sort of published work on the idea of keyboard duos in 18th century Europe, I've tried to show that, in fact, many people who had the means, the wealth to collect more than one keyboard instrument used harpsichords and fortepianos together in duets. And they were not, it's not like the fortepiano suddenly overtook the harpsichord and everyone threw their harpsichords out the window, although that's known to have happened during the French Revolution. But really, they coexisted for some decades toward the end of the 18th century. So to be sure, in adopting and advocating for these different keyboard mechanisms, Brillon showed herself to be an erudite, progressive collector of instruments. In addition, these keyboard duos and trios that she wrote allowed the salonière to play with her guests, or indeed with her 2 young daughters. From a musical standpoint, however, I think the purpose of this juxtaposition of diverse keyboard instruments was the consideration and foregrounding of timbre. In a period when keyboard technologies developed and proliferated very quickly, and we don't usually kind of think about this, the happily messy landscape of keyboard technologies that existed during the second half of the 18th century, but in that period, keyboard instruments came to be understood as encompassing or capable of imitating all the sounds of the orchestra, and variation in timbre was used as an expressive device. While the most fanciful keyboard instruments were produced in Germany, with one builder boasting in 1783 that his combination keyboard instrument produced no fewer than 250 different timbres, imitating all the sounds of the orchestra and combinations thereof, English and French builders were equally convinced of the expressive potential of timbre. While French builders were relatively slow to start building pianos of their own, they did modify their harpsichords through the introduction of new technologies. So most famously in 1772, the harpsichord builder Pascal Tasquin introduced what he called his pot de buffle, a rank of buffalo leather plectra, which responded to variation in finger weight, just as piano keys respond to variation in finger pressure. As one report had it, these buffalo leather plectra caress the string, producing sounds that are tender, passionate, dying. Still, English square pianos became increasingly common in fashionable circles in Paris, starting in the 1770s. So again, Madame Brillon was like the prophet of this instrument in the 1760s. The precise dates of Brillon's compositions are unknown. Based on stylistic criteria, musicologist Bruce Gustafson conjectured that they all come from circa 1775 to 85. I think that that's actually a little bit late because we know that she owned the English square by 1768 when Fragonard painted her portrait. But the starting date that Gustafson suggests makes some sense because her oldest daughter, Cunégonde, no kidding, would have been 9 or 10 at the start of that period, perhaps just old enough to play duets with her mother. The middle movement of Brillon's C minor duet highlights her interest in timbral contrast. She notes that the harpsichordist should play avec la sourdine, with mutes on the harpsichord. So you can see that in a box on the left side of the screen, which might be a reference to a buff stop or perhaps even the pot de buffle. It's not clear if she owned an instrument like that. Brillon's choice of this timbral effect was a conscious one designed to suit the simple harp-like accompaniment that she writes for the harpsichord in this movement. The accompaniment serves as a backdrop for a lyrical melody presented in the piano part. Naturally, the sourdine may be applied just as well at the discretion of the performer in music where it's unnotated. But this example shows Brillon explicitly exploiting timbral contrast. So here is a little audio recording of this sweet movement from a recording that I made with forte pianist Yihang Yang. in its simple ABA form, its use of that lyrical melody and its gentle, muted, harp-like accompaniment, the movement evokes song. And indeed, I think it bears much in common with Brillon's own song compositions. Those pieces, contained in a manuscript volume titled Romance, are invariably strophic, written for a female voice, probably her own voice or that of her daughters, with an accompanying keyboard part made up of arpeggiated figuration in one pattern or another. Many of these keyboard parts contain special performance instructions. For example, here, avec la grande pédale, or lié, meaning legato or connected. The effects of the pedal are not just to facilitate legato playing, however. They also have an effect on the whole timbre and resonance of the instrument. Burney himself noted this when he wrote that Brillon's constant use of the damper-raising pedal approximated the sound of bells. So that is a timbral statement. It's a statement about the timbre of the instrument, which it's not just about the blurring of harmonies, but also about the resonance and the whole timbral effect. In composing her romance in this manner, likely for her own performance or her daughter's, Brillon was adopting the model in widespread use in France and described, I should play a little bit of the song. Sorry. Here it is. This is my favorite one. In composing her romance in this manner, likely for her own performance or her daughter's, Brillon was adopting the model in widespread use in France and described by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. For Rousseau, the romance is a strophic song with a simple, touching style and a taste that is a bit antique, with no ornaments, nothing mannered, and a sweet, natural melody. And there's that word again. The manner of performance, moreover, should be naive. Rousseau goes on to suggest that an unaccompanied voice is still all that is needed for the ideal performance of a romance. It is certain that any accompaniment from an instrument detracts from the impression of the song. To sing a romance, nothing is required but a clear, correct voice, which pronounces well and sings simply. A number of the poetic texts that Brillon set in her romance were actually published with different melodies, some by aristocratic men and women, and all without accompaniment, in the multi-volume Recueil de Romances of 1767. Madame Brillon's unpublished song settings, with their lush accompanimental textures and their enthusiastic use of the damper-raising pedal, thus provide an important contrast and insight into her musical priorities. Paradoxically, she uses the technologies available to her to mask her artifice, to create the impression of an unstudied and purely natural approach to music. In fact, musicologist Erin Helyard has linked Brillon's generous use of the damper pedal, especially in passages with arpeggios, to the sound of the Aeolian harp, an instrument to which many were attracted, quote, because the forces of nature controlled it. Helyard continues, quote, although Burney refers dismissively to the sound of the square piano as an imitation of bells, it's entirely possible that Brillon was adding reverb to an instrument in a small room, thus evoking for the performer and her listeners the expansiveness of the public realm, a realm that, whether indoors or outdoors, was generally considered off limits for the majority of female amateur performers. The same approach, I think, can be heard in Brillon's sonatas, and I'll just play a little bit of this one for you. The opening movement of the G minor sonata marked Andante con espressione, from a collection of works for which the ad libitum violin part is now lost, adopts a distinctly vocal style. You can even sort of hear the beginnings of Chopin nocturnes in this style, again with a simple harp-like accompaniment. Brillon seems to become lost in her own melody, repeating it again and again. Harmonic differentiation is slow in coming, time is suspended, and the only thing that seems to matter is the sound of the instrument. Remaining in the upper registers almost exclusively, she continues to evoke treble range chordal instruments, voices, and mechanisms like the Aeolian harp and the guitar. So here we go. Pause it there just in the interest of time. I should say that I firmly believe that pieces like this can be translated effectively onto the modern piano. There was, in fact, a recording of Brillon's complete keyboard works, the solo keyboard works, or keyboard works for which the ad libitum violin part is either lost or left out, that was released also around 2019-20. And I have to say, I'm not going to name the performer, but the whole thing is so foursquare. It's so like metrical, very regular, no flexibility, no tempo rubato, that I think that, you know, if modern pianists are going to adopt this repertoire, then at least the kind of spirit of the thing in this like really flexible, ephemeral mode, I think is super important. And so just want to put in a plug for like giving it a try, not to treat it like kind of, oh, it's classical and therefore must be completely even and, you know, regular. It's not classical. There's like no such thing, right? It's expressive, and that's what she was going for. Okay, so recall Burney's report that Brillon plays on several instruments, knows the genius of all that are in common use, which she said it was necessary for her to do to avoid composing for them such things as were either impracticable or unnatural. Certainly in her keyboard writing, her goal seems to have been to adopt an air of the natural, despite and perhaps as a function of the complexity and novelty of the technologies at her disposal. She uses the piano and harpsichord idiomatically, exploits the piano's pedals for expressive purposes, and becomes totally lost in the sonorities of her instrument. This approach to the keyboard is evident too in her accompaniments for the songs, a genre designed to evoke the natural above all. To judge from Bernie's comment, she must have known the violin as well, and perhaps even the cello, two other instruments for which she wrote. He may not have named them specifically because so few aristocratic women would have wanted to be associated with those apparently unseemly instruments. In any case, her compositions provide ample evidence of her prodigious keyboard technique, her pursuit of lyricism, and her immersion in cantabile melodies, and her overarching interest in timbre and resonance. So thus far, right, we have evidence about Brillon's ideas, her own as reflected in her own compositions. But what about her influence on a larger stage? And I think we can discern such an influence through engagement with some of the pieces that were dedicated to her or written for her for performance in her salon. So if, as I'm suggesting, Brillon's musical aesthetics are captured only incompletely in her compositions, a fuller picture may be seen in the music that she collected, and especially the music by professional composers dedicated to her. For example, this book, the Opus 5 Sonatas for Keyboard and Violin by Luigi Boccherini. There has been a tendency in past scholarship to view dedications as primarily utilitarian. In this understanding, composers of the 18th century dedicated their works to a patron solely to increase the prestige and with it the marketability of their publications, and also to get some money. This functional layer was surely at play in many cases. It was one of the ways in which composers navigated the changing European markets for music that came with the increase in musical amateurism and the disruption of earlier systems of patronage that had them employed full-time in churches or courts. However, scholars like Emily Green have recently begun to question this simplistic understanding of musical dedications. Without denying the function of dedications with respect to prestige, money, and commercial success, Green argues that they may also carry aesthetic and creative weight, especially when composers began to dedicate their works to one another, and even to quote or otherwise reference each other's works. In such cases, as Green writes, quote, dedications implicate the dedicatee in allusion to some degree by providing the reader up front with the name of a secondary influence, the source for the possible allusion. Dedications could also allude to particular performers, to their characteristics as players, their habits, and their tastes. While letters of dedication to aristocrats such as Madame Brillon are often formulaic by necessity and clearly involve, a level of flattery that was considered essential, the precise terms in which such letters appear can tell us a lot. So I want to reference now the letter of dedication that Boccherini writes to Madame Brillon. He says, "Madame, I have never before composed for the keyboard. I heard you play on that instrument, and then I wrote these sonatas. The homage that I offer you through them is simultaneously a fitting tribute and one of reconnaissance. You have inspired them, and you embellish or ornament them." The term that Boccherini uses here, reconnaissance, encompasses multiple meanings. It implies recognition or re-knowing or remembrance. As explained in the royally sanctioned French-English dictionary of the 1780s, reconnaissance is an act by which one recognizes having received something or being obligated by a duty. Reconnaissance allows one to place oneself in the spirit of the idea or the image of a thing or person. So the idea here is that Boccherini's sonatas are crafted in the image of Madame Brillon. While it's possible that Boccherini meant only to recall the experiences that they had shared, there's reason, I think, to take the rest of this dedication seriously. Is it possible to imagine that Brillon actually inspired something in particular about Boccherini's sonatas? So you may know that Boccherini was a cellist and primarily a player and composer of string music. So musicologist Elizabeth Le Guin has described aspects of his string writing that include textile-like writing or textures, an astonishing repetitiveness, an affection for extended passages with fascinating textures but virtually no melodic line, all right? An obsession with soft dynamics, a unique ear for sonority, and an unusually rich palette of introverted and mournful affects. They gave Boccherini an unmistakable profile both to the ear and under the hand. So I think what we're seeing here is when Boccherini was in Paris, he was there for 6 months in 1767 or 8, he visited the salon of Madame Brillon. He got to know her musical style, which I think you could actually take the words of Elizabeth Le Guin describing Boccherini and apply them equally in the keyboard idiom to Madame Brillon and her compositions. And I think what we have here is a translation of Madame Brillon's keyboard idiom to Boccherini's style of composition. So in the Opus 5 sonatas dedicated to Madame Brillon, Boccherini found a keyboard-based language analogous to that of his string style. Melodic fragments meander, calling to and answering one another, supported by, again, a harp-like bed of arpeggiated figures. More than simple Alberti bass lines, these arpeggiated figures appear in all registers of the keyboard instrument, creating a textile familiar from Boccherini's string music. Harmonic shifts occur at times without notice, and surprising changes from major to minor mode alter both mood and timbre. So I'm going to play just a little bit of this opening movement of Boccherini's Sonata Opus 5, number 4, so you can see some of that, see and hear some of that, some of the texture, which should be familiar, I think, from the approach that Madame Brillon took to her own keyboard compositions. This is the wrong score excerpt, sorry. And in their fast movements, quick, light, stop. I don't know how to stop it. Oh my God. Hello, 1 second. Okay. All good. In their fast movements, quick, light figuration creates washes of sound that seem to mask the individual notes in favor of large-scale color. So here is hopefully just one excerpt from a fast movement of the same sonata. Although the title pages of Boccherini's sonatas suggest that they're playable on any keyboard instrument, the English square piano in Brillon's home would have supported the features that I've described of Boccherini's writing. In contrast to the clear articulations available on Viennese and German pianos, the English squares sound best when played with the lightest touch or when played with the damper pedals engaged. The hammers of the action merely brush the strings, and with the damper raising pedal, the instruments seem to paint in broad watercolor strokes. Moments of articulate phrasing emerge from the texture only to fade away again. So the surprising thing, one of the surprising things about the English square is the way that it can achieve like the softest whispers of sound, as well as a really deep and resonant bass, kind of bass sound with a lot of reverb and rich sonorities and overtones. So Rudolf Rasch, who has created a wonderful modern edition of the Opus 5 sonatas, notes that there is no evidence suggesting that Boccherini was ever a keyboard player himself. Nevertheless, the writing of the keyboard part of the sonatas is mostly quite idiomatic, and I happily confirm this point. They're a joy to play. If you haven't had a chance to try them, please do. This is all the more striking given Boccherini's admission that he had never before composed for the keyboard, and in fact, he would not attempt to do so again until the 1790s, when he revised these same sonatas and composed then his quintets for piano and strings, Opus 56 and 57. So there was another kind of 25, 30-year hiatus before Boccherini even returned to keyboard writing at all. It's difficult to imagine that Boccherini suddenly developed his perfectly idiomatic approach to the keyboard performance and composition all on his own, only to abandon it again for some 30 years. However, if we take his dedication to Madame Brillon seriously, then the possibility emerges that these pieces grew out of his experiences in her salon, listening to her, conversing with her, learning from her, playing alongside her. Burney provides evidence that informal sight reading was a normal component of her musical gatherings, so it requires no stretch of the imagination to think that Brillon might have tested Boccherini's sonatas and provided feedback on their playability and idiomatic use of the instrument. From an aesthetic standpoint, as well as a technical one, Boccherini's sonatas and Brillon's compositions have much in common. The ineffability of their melodic material, their repetitive use of fragmentary motives, the way they place melodies atop a layer of watercolor accompaniments, their concern with the exploration of timbre of the timbres of each register, all these point to a nexus of their aesthetic interests. To be sure, Brillon's compositions must be understood as amateur efforts unintended for the public, but they provide ample evidence of these central musical values. Boccherini's sonatas adopt and adapt these central musical values and place them in the public sphere. So he sort of translates them into a professional idiom, an idiom that's meant for public consumption, and that indeed is published as his Opus 5. To be sure, the example of Boccherini's Opus 5 is extreme. Most of the composers who dedicated music to Brillon were keyboardists, and we can't necessarily expect to find that they altered their technique or their compositional approach because of her. Nevertheless, she and her salon may still have cultivated composers' work in more than simply financial or utilitarian ways. So here, for example, is the letter of dedication of Henri-Joseph Riegel, who dedicated his Opus 7 sonatas to her. In publishing this work under your protection, I would create a monument to your rare talents as a keyboardist, to your true connoisseurship of music, the excellence of your taste, the justness of your discernment, and finally to your declared beneficence for all that is meritorious. If there are any new or happy ideas in these sonatas, it is you who has inspired them. I have recorded, this is like really, I think, very, very interesting and beautiful. I have recorded them in those moments of enthusiasm in which you have ravished your listeners. In other words, she plays, he's sitting there listening and is inspired, or so he says, to compose these pieces. While Madame Brillon's compositions, in conclusion, were private documents, they provide valuable evidence of her musical ideals and concerns, and they found their way into the public sphere through the sociability of her salon. Her aesthetic tastes and the ways in which she brought them to life at her square piano and her other keyboard instruments can be discerned in Boccherini's writing. His compositions dedicated to her provided her with an indirect and socially sanctioned means of presenting her private musical persona to a public world. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm happy to have some discussion if you all have questions, or we can, however you want. Yes, yeah, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Rebecca, for such a fascinating and vivid presentation.
Thank you.
Beautiful performances as well. We really brought it all to life and evoked it wonderfully. And it's just also such a great pleasure to host this series with the Piano Teachers Congress of New York here at Hunter. I'm so glad that you've been able to partner in all of this as well.
Thank you.
So among many fascinating tangents and details that you brought up that I started thinking about has to do with the issue of the damper pedal. And at this time, in such an early period of the technology of the piano, and thinking about the earliest pieces that I know of where this issue of sort of long pedals and harmonic work come up, like with the Haydn C major sonata, which is controversial, of course. What open pedal means, does it mean the damper pedal, does it mean the unicorda? It was never really resolved. But the way it's written, it seems to imply, with sort of all these floating notes, that it could be a damper pedal, or the Moonlight.
Or the Moonlight,
Sonata,
right.
Of course. But these are later works.
Yes.
I mean, Haydn, 1794 or something like that. So this is the earliest, you've presented the earliest discussion I think I've encountered about documentation of discussion about how much to use the pedal and when to use it, and what does it sound like. And I was wondering if there were further manifestations of this that you found, other than what you presented today, or if you were aware of other instances of these kinds of discussions or use in scores going back to like the 1770s and 1780s.
So these, I think, occur, her indications of pedal markings, I think, occur, by the latest 1775 and probably earlier, right? And she had this instrument by 1768. So I am not thinking of instances right now that predate these, but I think that there is a really interesting general principle that I've sort of encountered in thinking about manuscript culture versus print culture. By definition, print culture needs to be accessible to more people than manuscript culture, than manuscripts, because print editions need to be sold. And so if they have very specialized, specific indications that would require the player to have a piano versus a harpsichord, like over a harpsichord, the composer and publisher would automatically be limiting their audiences. So published editions are much less likely to include those kinds of specific designations early on in the adoption of a new technology. Manuscripts, by definition, being private and available only really for private use or within a private circle, a limited circle, you can expect everybody in Madame Brillon's salon who played her piano would have understood that the pedals were available and that they had a really cool effect and that she liked them, so her circle probably liked them, and she showed everybody, hey, look at this, what I can do. Bernie was not so into it, but that's also, I think, a national, Bernie, I guess the London aesthetic is a very different aesthetic than the Parisian one, which is, I think, more harp-based. Right, the arpeggiation that she uses in the sonatas and in the songs, I think it's connected to a harp idiom. So, and just one other example that I'm thinking of where a manuscript has instructions that are so specific that you would not find in a printed edition is in the last composition of Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the double concerto for harpsichord, fortepiano, and orchestra, which he designates specifically. This is the harpsichord part, this is the fortepiano part, and that's super uncommon. It's very, very uncommon. In France, in fact, Riegel, Henri-Joseph Riegel, also published pieces with those designations, but he also offered them in alternate scoring, so you didn't actually have to play them on two keyboard instruments. You could play them on keyboard instruments with other chamber configurations. So the CPE Bach concerto is so specific in its instrumentation, probably because it seems to have been written for Sarah Levy, another salonière and keyboardist in Berlin, who owned, again, harpsichords, fortepianos, and even clavichords as late as the 1790s, and maybe even into the 1800s. So because he was writing for that specific setting and only in manuscript, he wrote in the instrument designations. But if he had ever published that work, it would only have been called a concerto for clavier 1 and clavier 2. That's my hypothesis. So that doesn't have to do necessarily with pedal technology, but it's sort of about these differences in print culture and manuscript culture, and why the pedal markings you can see them very early on in her manuscripts, but you don't see them in published works. I hope that helps a little bit. But.
No, it's really illuminating.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yes, Rita.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got introduced to Madame Brillon and how you discovered her and how you found all of this amazing?
Sure, yeah. So I came at Madame Brillon actually because of Sarah Levy. I was working on a project with a colleague at Rutgers to understand Sarah Levy, who was, again, a salonière in Berlin and a Jewish woman, from a multidisciplinary perspective. So with my colleague from Rutgers in the Department of Jewish Studies, we started kind of organizing conference and events, and we wound up publishing an edited book of essays by scholars from different fields, kind of looking at Sarah Levy's world from different perspectives. And I, as part of that, this was the first time that I had the really wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Ihang Yang as a forte piano harpsichord duo. And so we started playing keyboard duets that Sarah Levy collected. She was apparently not a composer, but she collected a huge number of scores, including duets for 2 keyboards. And because we knew that she owned both a harpsichord and a fortepiano, at least one of each, we tried them on harpsichord and fortepiano together. And it was just, it's really been the most enjoyable, I think, aspect of my artistic life in the last decade. It's like playing these keyboard duets is so much fun. It's like playing forehand music, but more, I don't know. And so I was sort of starting to think about that phenomenon of keyboard duets and the use of the harpsichord and fortepianos of various sorts together with one another, juxtaposition of the 2 types of instruments. And that's what led me to Madame Brillon. And then I think for me, Madame Brillon became, she sort of forced me to open up my thinking about women in music in a much broader way. So Madame Brillon is one of those figures about whom so many people know about her, but very few people play her music, know her music. And I think that there are some respects in which her music has made some players and scholars uncomfortable. When I was Ihang and I were first working on a project around her keyboard duet compositions, and we posted one movement, a fast movement from that C minor duet on social media, and there were people who commented on this, that this is like really bad music. It's really banal. It's really bad music. And I had to think a lot about that. Like, what was the yardstick by which she was being measured? Does this composition reflect well on her? Would she have wanted me to put it out in public in that way? And so, yeah, I know, don't be sad. It's okay. I think it's you frowning, even in the dark. I think, so on the one hand, what that person who commented on the video, what he said was, if you're going to put up music by women, like the usual stuff that you hear, right? If you're going to put up music by women composers, it should reflect well. You should know that they're representing all women composers, and she should sound more like Fanny Mendelssohn. Was basically but I think it's really a good question, because we know that she did not publish her music, and she didn't put it out there in the public sphere, and she wasn't even necessarily well trained. Like the songs, I presented this material once at a colloquium where someone pointed out that she has parallel fifths in her song accompaniments. And she didn't have composition lessons. She wasn't trained in a church choir school where she would have learned counterpoint. So does that mean that, why is that the yardstick, right, against which she's being judged? So I think what I've sort of had to come to terms with and tried to do really in my approach to writing about and playing music by all dare I say all composers, but certainly all women composers, is that I feel I have a responsibility to them. And I want to put out music that reflects well on them and that presents them in the light that they could be, a light that they could be proud of, as if I know, as if I know what that is. And that's, there's like a certain hubris even in suggesting such a thing. But it's why when we put out this recording, we only included that one movement from the C minor duet. Because, like the fast movements, it's like a lot of scales up and down the keyboard. It's sort of a lot of static harmonies. And without that lyricism, I guess I felt like it doesn't represent her as well as I think she would want to be represented in public. So I want to try to present, I feel, again, like just a responsibility to her. This is not exactly what you were asking about. But I think it's, the experience helped me to think a lot about my obligations to historical women. I want to meet them on their own terms and try to judge them by the yardsticks that they judge themselves to the extent that I can figure out what those are. And that's why I think I'm trying to focus on instrument technology and timbre and sound and melody and, the ephemeral aesthetic of her that she cultivated and her connection to this beautiful instrument. And avoid, like, I'm not discussing sonata forms, and I'm not discussing, things that are, kind of more counterpoint and voice leading, which I think don't cast her in such a beautiful light. There's just one other case that I've been working on and thought a lot about is that of a late 17th century Italian composer named Marietta Morosina Priuli. So I've been working with Lucas Harris, who's a lutenist in Toronto, to create a reconstruction. Lucas is working on a reconstruction of a set of trio sonatas for which we have the bass line and one violin part, but not the second violin part. And I've written a kind of introduction which tries to, understand her biography when there's very little evidence and so on. So anyway, we presented this like a first draft of the reconstruction at a conference on women in music. And one of the things that we were conscious about was trying to understand like the way that in the 1660s, 1670s, when she was writing, the way that violin parts do or do not imitate one another in trio sonatas. And we included points of imitation, right? It's not like serious contrapuntal stuff. It's not fugues. They're not ricercars. They're light trio sonatas. But there are still points of imitation. If you look at the music of Cazzati and look at the music of Marini and other Italian composers writing in this genre, there are points of imitation. So we included some points of imitation in reconstructing the second violin part. And somebody said to us, well, wait a second, how would she have known how to write points of imitation? I'm like, first of all, it's not that hard. But second of all, I think that it's our job to represent her as well as possible. Is it definitely the way she would have written? No, but we don't have evidence of that. So we're going to assume that she knew some other pieces in this genre and was able to adopt the techniques that were in common use, in her own music. So there too, like, what's our responsibility? I think for me, I want to cast these composers in the most positive light possible. Maybe that's gilding the lily. I don't know, but so be it.
I have a question. Wonderful presentation. Really
Thank you.
Yeah, this is great. Do we know if like some, especially the big piano composers that came maybe a few generations later, like the Chopins and the Liszts and the Romantic period and that kind of stuff, would they have been familiar with her music? Like I know when you said one piece sounded, a little Chopin nocturne-ish, would he have maybe been privy to her music, or did that come much later?
I think it's very unlikely that he would have known her music, but I think that her music came to be, it was part of a broader aesthetic culture within France. So by the 1780s, you start to see songs written with the same kind of harp-like accompaniment that she was using, I think, in the late 1760s, early 1770s. So again, like the manuscript culture is ahead of the print culture. So I think that those aesthetic ideals would still have been part of the aesthetic landscape that Chopin got to know in his youth. Yeah?
Did she have any ties to the monarch?
Yes. Yeah, she was a member of the aristocracy. Her husband was a kind of low-level aristocratic functionary. He worked for one of the government agencies, I guess. She survived the revolution, but laid low, really, after the revolution, like many aristocrats did. Actually, there's another interesting case of Antoine and Marie-Anne, I think is her first name, Lavoisier. So he was the kind of father of modern chemistry, and she was this musician, salon hostess. They also hosted Benjamin Franklin when he was there in Paris, and they hosted salons, and she created a music collection. So famously, Lavoisier was beheaded during the Terror. He was guillotined during the Terror, and she had to kind of pick up the pieces of her life after. Sorry, well, that was a little gory. After the revolution, and she became again. She sort of went back to hosting salons in the 19th century and had a large music collection then that reflects kind of operatic culture, piano culture. I think she owned a copy of the piano pedagogical works by Montgeroux. So she was like really immersed in musical life, and in a very public way. Like people knew that she hosted salons after the revolution. But Madame Brillon sort of, as far as we understand, I think laid low pretty much after the revolution.
Okay, wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.